I will just start us off very briefly by welcoming everyone. My name is Mark Schaefer. I'm the membership associate here with the Linguistic Society of America. It's my privilege and honor to welcome you all to our monthly webinar. And without too much delay, I'm going to turn things over to Archie, who will get things started for us on this interesting and compelling topic. So Archie, take it away.
Thanks. Lex, I can see that you started sharing, but it looks white to me. Can other folks see the PowerPoint?
It also looked okay. I can try it again. Let's see if it'll come together. Okay, you can see that?
Yes.
Okay. And how about now?
No.
Can you see it, Archie? No. Okay. Okay. So this is okay, but this is not, it seems.
For all the tech run through, we just no.
Yeah, it was working totally fine just in our tech. So why don't I just like give this another try, and then okay, and now?
Nope.
No, eh? Okay. Okay. All right. So that's unfortunate. But it doesn't seem to want to do it when. So another option that I can think of is, I don't know if GoToWebinar allows you to share part of your screen like you can on Zoom. I don't know if Mark is able to chime in on that.
Yeah, if necessary, I can see if I can do the share screen, and because I can pull it up as a PDF slideshow and share that screen. If you just tell me to advance the next slide if that's easier.
I'm not sure if that'll be ideal, considering we have some animations there, but that's okay. Let me just see if I can come up with an alternative here, real quick on the fly. Always a treat when this.
Use multiple monitors, are you?
I am, but I was before when we were doing our dry run too.
Okay.
And it didn't seem to be problematic then, but for one reason or another, it's certainly problematic now. So I'm just gonna try and I'm just gonna see if I can sort this out really quickly. Really sorry to everyone for the delay. Let's see. Yeah. This is like sort of your classic presentation nightmare. Okay, all right, let's see. No, not to share. Okay, okay. All right. So
do you want to try moving the presentation from whatever monitor you have to whatever other monitor you have? Yeah, we see it.
Yeah. Let's see if okay. How about now?
No, it's back to blank again.
Back to blank. Okay. All right. Well, let's see if I can do. Here's an idea. I can try and use the let's try that. What about now?
It's blank.
It seems like anytime I try to make it like full screen, it doesn't work. So the only option that I can really see here, I guess, is for us to just kind of go through it in the in this particular sizing.
There's
With
also
just like
the PDF version. Sorry.
the PDF version. Yeah, the PDF version is also an option. We'll just have to not have
Lex,
animations for it, but that can be fine.
are those your notes in the background? Because we can actually see the white thing as a screen, and then I could see like the edges of the slide just to the side of the white part. So it seems like there's another window that it's not showing us the content of, but it is showing us that there's a window there. I don't know if you
That's
can.
really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm
Do you
not really sure. I'm
Okay.
unfortunately not sure how to troubleshoot this. Like
Why don't we just
yeah, it's
I think the PDF will be fine.
okay. Let's just do that then. Now everything is a little bit discombobulated, but okay. I'm gonna stop sharing the PowerPoint. But I've sort of moved things around all over the place a bit here. But there we go. Okay. So how about now? Can you see
Yes.
see this one? Okay. I'm not sure how to make this full screen for a presentation though. Maybe just one at a time like that. How's that?
That's perfect.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So then we'll just
Speed
we'll
right
just make this work.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks for sitting with us as we figure that out. So as Mark said, this is our webinar about the LSA statement against linguistic misgendering. And before we get started, we just have a couple accessibility housekeeping notes. The presentation PDFs and PowerPoints handouts are in GoToWebinar under the handouts section, but you can also use this QR code to locate them on the LSA's website. If you do share anything from this presentation on social media, any screenshots of the slides or anything, please feel free to do so, but use any images that you use. And we also have interpreters here. And so if you're having any issues seeing them, their videos should be there. But if you are, just message us and we'll help you troubleshoot that. So my name is Archie Crowley. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of South Carolina. And I'm currently the chair of COZIL, which is the LSA's Committee for LGBTQ plus Issues in Linguistics. And I'm really grateful to have a great panel of presenters here with me today, who I'll let introduce themselves as they start their sections, but they were all contributors to the statement. And so I'm really glad to be able to hear their perspectives on how the statement is applicable in our academic lives. So before we get really started, some quick terminology. We'll talk at length about misgendering, which I'll define briefly here as what occurs when a person is called by a pronoun, title, gender label, or any other linguistic gendered feature that they don't use or identify with, regardless of intent. And what we're working towards is to use gender inclusive language as well as identity affirming language. And so gender inclusive language is language that doesn't impose external categories, such as a binary gender system, upon anyone who doesn't ascribe to that system or doesn't kind of presuppose that that exists. So for example, using they instead of saying he or she, whereas identity affirming language is language that potentially might involve attributing gender to someone, but it actively upholds a person's self-identification. So for example, using they to affirm someone's non-binary identity. And so both gender inclusive and identity affirming language are crucial in creating an inclusive environment to avoid misgendering people. So our plan for today is we're going to start with an overview about the statement itself, and then we'll have a presentation about avoiding misgendering in professional communications from Evan. Kirby will talk about doing gender in a linguistic study, and Lal will talk about pronouns in the classroom. We'll kind of wrap it up and have time for a Q&A. And so if you have questions, feel free again to put them in the chat and we'll have time to talk about that at the end. Okay, so now Lex, my colleague from the University of Toronto, and I will talk about the statement itself. So in May of 2021, the LSA Executive Committee approved the LSA Statement Against Linguistic Misgendering, which was written by COZIL members. A subcommittee of COZIL members wrote the statement. It was then drafted and edited by the broader COZIL committee, went through several rounds with the EC, and then it became what you see today. And when we wrote the statement, we considered kind of three major questions. What is misgendering and why is it harmful? Why should linguists care about misgendering? And why should linguists and the LSA advocate for gender affirming linguistic practices? So misgendering is harmful because at the baseline, it is a refusal to recognize and respect a person's identity. While misgendering can impact everyone, it disproportionately harms transgender people who are a minority within our linguistics community. And trans people already face negative mental health struggles, as well as related life outcomes such as poverty, homelessness, and unemployment. But research has shown that trans individuals have better mental health outcomes when they're supported by their communities. And one part of support is being gendered appropriately. And so our goal is to avoid doing active harm to trans people and communicate without misgendering them.
So misgendering is relevant from a linguistic perspective because misgendering is a speech act. It's a violent and emotionally impactful speech act. And this is true even in cases where the person does not intend to be harmful or is unaware of the harm that's taking place. So one of the primary ways that misgendering happens, at least in English, is when someone uses the wrong pronouns to refer to another person. But misgendering can also occur through other gendered linguistic forms like grammatical gender agreement morphology, gendered labels and categories, address terms, occupational terms. Dead naming is also a form of misgendering. So dead naming is the use of a person's previous name, often the name they were assigned at birth, which they no longer use, having chosen a new one that more accurately represents their identity. And given their significance as one of the most well-known ways of committing the linguistic act of misgendering, we do also devote some time in the statement to pronouns, and particularly advocacy for singular they, especially considering the many public conversations about its supposed grammaticality and its increasingly visible relationship to trans and gender diverse communities in particular. So many trans and non-binary people use singular they as their pronoun of reference, and it is important to use this pronoun appropriately, which is to say to use singular they for people who you know use it as their personal pronoun. Singular they can be useful as an ungendered pronoun, as I'm sure many of you in the audience are aware. Singular they has a long history in the English language as a generic ungendered pronoun, but it can still be used to implicitly misgender or degender people inappropriately. So if someone does not use singular they and you use this pronoun to refer to them, it's important to consider whether you may be implicitly misgendering them. And this is something that happens quite often to binary trans people and to trans women especially. So while we don't want to discourage people avoiding unnecessarily gendering people or using singular they as a means to avoid doing gender to someone through pronouns or making assumptions, it is something to be mindful about. And while many trans and non-binary people do use they as their pronoun, many also use he or she pronouns, other pronoun sets like neopronouns, or some combination of each. So if someone you know does use multiple pronoun sets and you feel uncertain about which ones you should use, it's good to just ask for clarification as to how someone would like those pronouns to be used. Some folks use multiple pronouns freely and interchangeably, others might use different pronouns in different contexts. So when in doubt, ask. The last thing that we would like to flag is that there's nothing inherently gendered about pronouns themselves. So some non-binary people might use he, him, or might use she, her pronoun sets, and that doesn't actually make those any less non-binary pronouns for those people. Non-binary pronouns are those that are used by non-binary people, full stop. And so pronouns are an obvious source of misgendering, but it's also important to consider how misgendering can occur in other contexts. So a lot of conversation on non-binary language in particular often focuses on English, but it's important to keep in mind that non-binariness is not at all an English-only phenomenon. And linguistic innovation and advocacy for trans and non-binary people is being done by linguists and trans and non-binary speakers of many languages. And those are not mutually exclusive categories either. So morphosyntactic gender agreement that genders the speaker or the addressee or any third person should be treated similarly to any other gendered linguistic feature. And again, keeping in mind that inappropriate gender agreement or morphology can constitute misgendering, which does disproportionately harm and alienate trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. So when working with languages that exhibit gendered morphosyntactic paradigms, look to what trans and non-binary people are doing with respect to creating and advancing affirming language. This is also important to take into account in things like study design, which I think Kirby's going to talk about a little bit later in the webinar. So there's more and more work that is being done on this, and there are communities of speakers for languages all throughout the world. Spanish, French, Swedish, Hebrew are just a few quick examples, all of which have robust non-binary communities of speakers that publicly share resources regularly. But we also want to boost the work of Ben Papadopoulos and his colleagues at the Gender and Language Project, who are compiling a free online resource of gender inclusive forms and languages that do mark gender distinctions. So we strongly suggest that you check out their terrific work. So misgendering can also occur with terms for gender labels and categories. So phrases like men and women or ladies and gentlemen presume and reinforce a gender binary, exclude non-binary people. There are a wide array of inclusive alternatives depending on the audience and the level of formality. I think Evan's going to talk a little bit more about this in his presentation shortly. Likewise, for occupational terms like actress or waitress, or terms of address honorifics like sir and ma'am, those should be used with care. So here we'd also just like to provide a signal boost to the LSA guidelines on inclusive language that was written by COZIL, which grew out of the former guidelines for non-sexist usage. They talk about this a fair bit. Oh, I forgot to advance my slide there, sorry about that. So why should all of this matter to linguists? For starters, fundamentally, linguists are people and people should endeavor to be kind. But from a specialization standpoint, linguists are uniquely positioned to advocate for gender affirming linguistic practices. And actually, we would say they have a responsibility to bring their professional insights to bear on creating more just worlds for trans people. And avoiding misgendering is really a basic ground floor level way to do this. Linguists rightly reject prescriptivism as an ideology of language concerned with determining which language variants are inherently superior to others, and also the policing of their use. But linguists are also especially qualified to assess the effects of speech acts on communities and on people, and to identify those that either affirm them or cause harm. With that said, though, our commitment to descriptivism should itself be handled with care and responsibility and an attention to its effects. So with respect to prescriptivism, it's not necessarily the case that rules or prescriptions are themselves inherently bad, but it's what they do that really matters. It's the harming of people via linguistic gatekeeping or language policing that we don't want as linguists. So in this sense, advocating for best practices in referring to people appropriately and with compassion and with affirmation are not inconsistent with descriptivist value system, but that descriptivist value system must be a political one that's invested in people's well-being. So this is really what's at the heart of the statement, its essence, which is that COZIL and the LSA affirm the right of transgender people to participate in linguistics, both as a science and as a professional field, free from harassment or microaggressions. And our hope is that this statement is at least one initiation of advancing our commitment to these values as a broader linguistics community. So that's it for Archie and my introduction. So I'll pass it over to Evan to take it up from there.
Thanks, Lex. Am I the present? There we go. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is kind of following up on what Lex gave as a great introduction to the kind of rationale and philosophical basis for the issuing the statement, with more practical guidelines, right, based on discussions that we had in COZIL, as well as just my own personal experience. And I'm sure, you know, in the question period, people might have their own examples to share about this. And I should just note that this is all contained in a supplement to the actual statement on misgendering. It's available on the same page as the statement, also as a handy PDF. But these are sort of a more in-depth look at, you know, how to actually put these ideas into practice in situations that you might encounter in your professional life. And that document contains a number of different recommendations for ways to put these into action. And I'm going to run through most of these pretty quickly. The last few I'm going to leave for Lal to talk about in the discussion of how to put this into play in teaching specifically, because there are some unique issues that come into play there. But these are the recommendations for how to, as you're going about your professional life, you know, communicating with colleagues, whether you are in academia, education, or in a different professional context. These should all be things that are relevant to you. And so these are to, in general, choose gender neutral terms when you can, so that you can be maximally inclusive. Avoid unnecessarily binary terms when you can do that. And in general, always try to get everyone's appropriate pronouns and other language correct, right? To do your best to get the most accurate information as you can. And finally, as Lex was getting to at the end of that, you don't need to stop there. You can go further, and you can actually, you know, help your colleagues and your students and other folks to learn how to do this better by helping them out when they make a mistake, or generally just informing them about these very issues and kind of spreading the word within linguistics or within our institutions more generally. So let's take a look at some of these in a little more detail with some kind of examples, and I'm sure we can bounce around some other examples later. The first of these, I think, is the most general and the easiest, but we'll start with choosing gender neutral terms whenever you can, because this is the easiest way to include everyone, right? Rather than using a gendered term, if you can use general terms like linguists, professors, students, or people, you are including everyone. This seems intuitive, but sometimes, you know, it can actually trip us up, because oftentimes you will encounter language using binary pairs of words, which at first might feel more inclusive, right? This is often done in an effort to be more inclusive, but when we reflect on it, we need to really think, are these really more inclusive, right? Is he or she actually more inclusive? Well, it's more inclusive than using the generic he for short, but if you use singular they, then you're really sure that you're including everyone. Same goes for men and women, ladies and gentlemen, and so on. If you can use general words like people or children, friends, colleagues, then you are you're being sure that you're including everyone. When you're talking about specific people rather than you know, speaking about people generally, you always want to try to be accurate, right? And so you always want to try to find out the pronouns and other terms that someone uses, just like you would with anything else about them, right? So for example, if you're talking about a new person who is, say, you know, giving a talk at your institution, right, you would want to find out what their pronouns are, just like you would want to verify other information that you would use to talk about them, right? And what's important to note here, Lex also noted this, is that some people use multiple sets of pronouns or language, and they might use different ones in different contexts. So that is another important piece of information that you want to get as well. Ask them how they would like to be addressed and talked about in the particular context in which you're interacting with them. When you don't know what someone's pronouns or other language is, a good strategy is to use singular they, at least until you know better, right? So if you don't know if someone uses he or she or a neopronoun, you can use they until you get more information or until you have a chance to ask them. Right? You can also avoid using pronouns at all, but this is generally something you should do as a last resort, right? They is a pretty safe bet until you know otherwise. The key point there is until you know otherwise. Once you know that the correct terms are something different, you should switch to those once you know. Okay, going a step beyond getting this gendered language right, you can do a little bit better by helping those around you do a better job of gendering or avoiding misgendering. And in my experience, the way that this can happen differs a little bit depending on whether you have a kind of a written context or a conversational context, right? In a written context, if I see a colleague, a student, or a friend being misgendered, I generally start with, a private message or a conversation with the person, and I assume goodwill to start off with, right? Providing some information. So I might say about a student, if I happen to know a student's pronouns are different than might be generally known, I would have a conversation with my colleague about that or send them a quick message saying, hey, I just thought you should know this. These are the correct pronouns or the correct name to use for this student. And this is particularly important when there are power differentials involved, right? So if we're talking about colleagues who are more junior or students or other folks who may not be in a position to correct people who are misgendering themselves, right? Because they feel like that could put them at risk, or that they don't have the professional power to be able to do that. In a conversational context, this most often, in my experience, comes up often when the person being misgendered is not even in the room or in the conversation, which makes it all the more important for someone else who knows better to speak up on their behalf. So I generally have a kind of multi-stage escalating process for correcting that. The first way is to just model the correct pronoun, right? If I'm having a conversation and someone is using the wrong pronoun for someone else, I will just refer to them using the correct pronoun. Often the person will pick up on that, and then everyone will go on their way using the correct pronouns. If they don't pick up on that, I'll actually interrupt. So if they say, oh, she said this, and I'll go, actually, it's he, right? And then we'll go on. And then, if that doesn't work, we might have an explicit conversation about, hey, I noticed that you're using this pronoun, but this is the actual pronoun for that person. So a common question that comes up when we're putting these guidelines into play is, wait a minute, are you saying that I can't say whatever, the things that I've suggested replacing? Like, for example, are you saying that I can't say women anymore, or I can't say whatever? No, definitely not. We're not banning words, right? The LSA is not saying that you shouldn't say some words and not others. What we are suggesting, though, is that you may want to pause to consider whether the word you're using is really what you mean, right? So when you say women, do you really mean women? When you say men, do you really mean men, and so on? And secondly, whether gender really matters in the context in which you're using these words, right? Or is it irrelevant to that context, and maybe a gender neutral term would be better? For example, if you're writing a policy for your department or program, does it apply to men and women, or does it simply apply to all employees, right? If you are running a program for girls, do you really mean girls, or do you mean some other underrepresented group, right? So these guidelines are really not just about language, but they're an opportunity for us to think about, how is our policy and our values as linguists, as academic programs, as corporations or other entities, how are our values actually reflected in the language that we use, and what does that communicate to other people? And lastly, this might be a chance to throw this to my fellow panelists here. I combed my recent emails to look for some examples of where I was encountering gendered language and gender neutral language as well, to see how some of my institutions, my colleagues were doing. These have been anonymized to protect the innocent as well as my job. But what we have here are some excerpts of different emails that I've received, where we can see sometimes people are doing pretty well, sometimes they could do a little bit better. But these are all emails I've received recently. So I'm curious what you think about how these folks could maybe improve their professional communications. Let's see, do I have it? I have a drawing tool. This is excellent. I love GoToMeeting now, or GoToWebinar. Okay, so so things that are good. Oh wait, where's my drawing tool? Highlighter. Faculty and staff, that's great, right? That's gender neutral. Then we have a curious case here. We have daughter, son, and young adult. Here's where I think there were good intentions, but things got a little funky in the editing, right? So daughter and son, that doesn't include everyone, so we added young adult. Well, actually, if we had just used young adult, we would have included everyone, or child, and so on. So if we really think about what this communicates, this would be like, I'd say, the 200 level of using gendered language in communication, right? Terms like freshman could be replaced by first year student, or upper class men and women, we could just say upper class students, right? So we can sort of like using the binary pairs is taking one step toward more inclusion. So instead of using freshmen, if we use men and women, that's one step, but we could go the whole way and use gender neutral things. Okay, so that is all I have in terms of examples, but we're going to hear more about those guidelines as they pertain to the research context and the classroom context coming up from Kirby and Lal. And I'm now going to attempt to pass to Kirby.
I'm going to attempt to be passed to. Okay.
I might need a little help, Mark.
Evan, at the top in the menu where it is like sharing in your control panel, there's on the right of that sharing menu, there's change presenter. Yes.
I got it. I did it. So
thank you.
All set to go.
Hello, I'm Kirby. I'm sharing my screen, hopefully correctly. We'll see. We'll also see if this, so I see that I'm sharing the screen that I don't want to share, and that my mouse is being weird because it's, okay. I'm going to change which screen I'm using and then try exactly that same thing again. Great, this is what I want to be sharing. And I'm going to time myself because I have a history of going over time on these things. So my fellow panelists, if I do go over time, you're allowed to unmute yourselves and holler at me. My name is Kirby. I am a visiting assistant professor at Swarthmore College. I am delighted to give a miniature version of some sort of methodology stuff that I've been talking about in a couple different venues. So at the end, I'll have sort of resources where I've talked more extensively about these things, but this is going to be changing gears a little bit. So far we've been talking about how to conduct ourselves as people and as professionals. As people, we should not misgender folks. That's generally just in terms of being a good person, it's good not to misgender people. And then as professionals, we should especially not misgender our colleagues, because that makes, you know, a really hostile working environment that sucks to exist in. So what I'm going to sort of switch our focus to a little bit is how to use gender as researchers. So this is going to be a little bit about how, you know, as linguists, we're people who are interested in sort of studying human behavior, which means we interact with humans a lot, and we want to interact with the humans that we interact with in an appropriate and ethical way. And then also we want to be able to report what we have sort of learned from our interactions in a way that does not hurt people and also does not promote ideas that are just false. So this is just going to be how to ask gender in a study. If you're doing a study in linguistics and you're talking about talking to people, how do you ask their gender? So one of the big questions that you need to start with is sort of, are you asking for somebody's gender or are you asking for somebody's sex? And the times that you're going to ask for somebody's gender are times that I think are familiar to a lot of us as sort of social scientists, where we're interested in how social identity might relate to some dependent variable, like a vowel raising before velar consonants. Ooh, I want to know if that's like a gendered thing. I also want to know how social relationships relate to a linguistic thing that I'm working at. I also want to know how hegemony or social hierarchy relate to the linguistic thing that I'm looking at. And this is oversimplifying just because, you know, this is a very mini talk, so I'm keeping it very simple. But, you know, asking about gender and talking about gender is also something we want to do because we want to think about how language use and speech acts can also constitute and create these social identities and social relationships and social hierarchies. So a lot of social stuff that might mean that you need to ask a participant what gender they are, or some sort of way of how they relate to their gender. However, there are times when linguists sort of feel like we need to ask about sex. And I have a little asterisk here where I'm actually not recommending that you ask somebody's sex. I'm doing air quotes because I don't think that that's very coherent of a term. So instead, I'm going to talk about sex-related characteristics. So just like gender is something that is very complex and exists in a social context, this is also true for stuff that we sort of group as the idea of sex. And so what I would really like to ask us to do is really pick apart what sex-related characteristic you're actually interested in. So are you interested in physiology, which is something that people believe vary by sex assignment at birth? If that's the case, then instead of asking sex assignment at birth, you might have an easier time by asking about or measuring the physiological sort of thing that you're interested in. So if you think somebody's size of their vocal tract is the relevant issue here, then you might need to either measure that directly or find a much closer correlate to measuring the size of somebody's vocal tract rather than using sex as kind of a proxy for that. And the reason for that is that sex is a very messy proxy, and it can contribute to sort of overzealous explanations. If you are thinking that the thing that you're interested in, the whatever language thing you're studying, might be related to hormone levels, then again, rather than asking for sex assigned at birth, you would have an easier time if you find a way to either measure hormone levels directly or find a closer correlate to hormone levels. And this is also something where sex assigned at birth is a very loose and unreliable proxy for hormone levels in adults. And you might not even be looking at a sort of age striated population. So you really need to think about what you're actually interested in. And if you're thinking about asking somebody's sex assignment at birth because you think childhood socialization related to early childhood is is the thing that is probably most relevant to what you're talking about, then you should ask about childhood socialization, because this is not something that correlates one-to-one with sex assigned at birth for a number of different reasons. But you know, this is something where asking purely just what is your biological sex, again, I'm doing air quotes, is not a good proxy for this, and you're going to get uninformative answers, or you're going to get answers that you can sort of overinterpret. So if you decide to ask gender, and I think that you should probably ask gender rather than sex. If you do decide to ask gender, I have some quick do's and don'ts. Do include an option to write in other terms. You are not going to be able to think of all the terms that people use to describe their gender. So it's a really good idea to add a write-in option, kind of no matter what. I also suggest, as a minimum, include at least 4 options: man, woman, and then neither or other. I've sort of grouped this together. There's some pros and cons of calling that one or the other, but something that's neither man or woman as sort of a catch-all category. And then you also need a category that's do not wish to answer. Notice that I have that as a separate thing from like the neither category, because those aren't the same. And my other strong suggestion of what you should do is be clear about what you're actually asking for, somebody's current gender identity, and why you're asking. So this is something about the conformed consent model of how we interact with people who decide to share their expertise and lived knowledge with us. It's important to tell them what we're doing and why. Some very strong don'ts. I do not recommend doing things where there's a category woman that's separate from trans woman or anything similar to this. The way that you separate your categories can sort of de-gender or actively misgender people. And so don't do that. Likewise, giving too few categories can implicitly misgender people or erase data that might be meaningful to you. So if your only 3 options are man, woman, and prefer not to say, you are sort of coercively lumping a bunch of non-binary people and potentially binary trans people in this prefer not to say category, along with people who simply prefer not to say. So you're losing information and you're sort of implicitly misgendering us. I also strongly discourage you from doing anything like this, the 3rd bullet point here, male/female/transgender. This is a couple really big problems with this. One is that male and female adjective forms sometimes can be confusing about whether you're asking for sex assignment or whether you're asking for gender identity. If you're asking for gender, I recommend using the words man and woman, or using the words that people use in the community that you're working with. And then the other big issue is that transgender is not a category that's separate from man or woman, and separating it out like this is, again, implicit misgendering. If you implicitly or explicitly misgender people who are volunteering their time and expertise to help you with your research, they're probably not going to like you, and they would be right to, and they won't help you with your research again. So, and you'll deserve it. The other thing I suggest avoiding is don't use terms like identify as. Someone who identifies as a man is a man. So this extra hedging is unnecessary and sort of implicitly misgenders people again. Okay, if you do decide to ask about sex-related characteristics, I have some do's and don'ts. Do's, ask for the actual information that's related to your hypothesis. So if you are asking about physiology, ask for something related to physiology. Don't just ask birth assignment and expect that that's going to correlate. It might not. Do be really clear about why you're asking, and ask in a way that's clearly unconnected to gender identity, again, so that you can avoid implicitly misgendering people who have decided to share their time and expertise with you. And the other thing is that I really strongly recommend, if you feel like you need to ask about assigned sex, I recommend sit down and think about what sex-related characteristic am I asking about, and is there any other possible way to ask about this? There's almost always an alternative, and if you sit down and really look at what you're trying to discover about the world, you will be able to figure out what the alternative is, but it's really like usually unnecessary. Some don'ts. Don't just ask for assigned sex at birth if you don't actually need that information. That's something where you're asking trans people to potentially out themselves. And if there's not a good reason for you to ask for that information, you should not. The best way to protect people from potential repercussions is to simply not collect sensitive information. I also don't recommend asking for biological sex because that's confounding several different things that might be what you're trying to ask, and it implicitly misgenders people. And also people can sometimes be a little bit confused about what you're asking for. So when I answer forms that ask for my biological sex, which happens every time I have to take a COVID screening, it's kind of like, well, I don't really know what you're asking. Are you asking about my hormone levels? Are you asking about, do you think that like some part of my physiology makes me more susceptible to COVID? Like, let's be specific here. And so sometimes you're getting inconsistent answers because you're asking an imprecise question. The other thing is that it's not ever appropriate to ask for biological sex if you're doing it to try and ask if somebody's trans. If you're trying to ask if somebody's trans, ask that. Just ask that. Yeah, that's my advice. So I want to give you sort of one strategy that's been really working for me across a couple different studies, and this has been my own studies as well as studies that I've advised among my students who are doing their research, which is that when you ask for gender, ask two questions. So the gender portion of the demographic survey has two separate questions. The first question is, what is your gender? And that's a free response question where people can give you any kind of information that they want. You get sort of very nuanced, useful, socially meaningful information about what people think is important to share with you. That's a really respectful and good way of approaching that. Even if you are, doing an online survey where you're getting 1,000 responses, you are respecting people's individual sort of relation to gender by giving them total freedom. And then the second question is sort of based on this informed consent model, which is the way that I phrase this is, what gender group would you like us to include you in for the purpose of this study? If I'm doing a survey where I think I'm going to get 1,000 responses, the free response question can give me nuanced information and insight into individuals, but it cannot give me useful quantitative data for making a bar chart. And sometimes we do have to make bar charts in order to publish our papers. So asking what gender group would you like to include us, would you like us to include you in, gives people sort of control over how you are using their data, where the answers are, I would like to be grouped with men, women, other, or do not wish to answer. These four options are kind of always your minimum. All right, I'm doing unprecedentedly well on timing. So the last thing I want to touch upon is how to write about and communicate your findings. So when you do studies in linguistics, frequently you give talks about them at conferences, or you write papers about them for journals, or you teach about them to students, sort of academic activities. And the sort of important things that I need you to think about are, one, never ever write in a way that misgenders your participants. That's not okay. These are, again, people who share their time and expertise with you. It's not okay to treat them badly, and misgendering somebody is treating them badly. Implicit and explicit misgendering are very bad. Don't do it. Two, don't discuss your research in a way that allows readers to erroneously group your participants by assigned sex at birth over gender. So if you did collect information on sex-related characteristics, you need to be very particular about how you discuss that so that readers can't come away with the understanding that assigned sex at birth is somehow more socially meaningful than gender. That's false and bad. Third, if you're doing, especially for very large studies, if you are finding that you're only getting 1 or 2 trans or non-binary participants, that means that you're recruiting not very well, and you need to make an intentional effort to recruit a more diverse population, because we cannot keep publishing large studies where trans and non-binary people are completely absent. And if you only get a few and you're like, well, I have to exclude them because they're outliers and I can't do stats on them, then we keep replicating creating this version of science that somehow only applies to cis people, and that is not good. And then my last suggestion is to, this is kind of prescriptive, but don't refer to biological sex without talking about what you're actually talking about. So if you're talking about one aspect of a sex-related characteristic, clarify what you're talking about. When you're writing academic articles, when you're teaching, when you're talking to the public, anything like this, be precise, because biological sex is this very fuzzy and easily confusable term. And honestly, we should just stop saying it. All right. I have, my final slide where I have some links for more info. I have a longer blog post that talks about this, and there's also a longer version of this talk that's sort of, there will be a recording, but I also would love to hear questions either today or online. So feel free to contact me. Now I'm going to end the show and stop showing. And then I am handing it over to Lal, I think, right? Okay.
That's right.
Yay.
All right. Excellent. Just share these slides here. Okay. Thanks so much. I'm really honored to be part of this webinar and to talk about these issues along with such fantastic linguists who are really the up and coming generation for this entire area of study. I do want to briefly acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Aniskoyo, Chumash land as a settler. And I want to recognize the Chumash people, their elders, past and present, as well as future generations, as the rightful stewards of this land and water. UC Santa Barbara was founded upon exclusions and erasures of Indigenous people, including those on whose land the institution is located. So I'm Lal Zimin. I'm an associate professor of linguistics at UC Santa Barbara. And I'm going to be talking about kind of the classroom perspective on these issues. So, oops, there we go. One of the challenges that we're facing presently is that there are really vast differences in the kind of knowledge and orientation and ability to execute trans inclusive and trans affirming language. And on our campuses, the very presence of trans people is often treated as a sort of a political issue rather than a matter of social justice. But these issues are urgently important for trans people's lives and well-being, and of course that includes our students. And we're in a moment where alongside we have this alongside of the growing interest in using trans affirming language, we also have increasing violence, institutional exclusions, legal targeting of trans people. So today I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the trans inclusive language practices I've written about before. Some of these were covered by previous speakers, so I won't spend much time on them. And I'm going to share some results from a survey that I conducted with a group of students of trans people at UC Santa Barbara. I'll offer some recommendations based on those results. And I just wanted to mention there will be a couple of examples of transphobic language. It's pretty ordinary, everyday kinds of transphobic language, but I wanted to mention it anyway. So some key points, as Lex mentioned, misgendering, yes, involves pronouns, but is certainly not limited to pronouns. Even focusing exclusively on English, there are many other ways in which misgendering takes place. And there are also tensions in what trans people are looking for in terms of strategies to avoid misgendering. So asking about pronouns is something that's really important to many trans students, but at the same time, there isn't necessarily universal acceptance or agreement about how and when and even whether pronouns should be asked about. And these tensions are part of what I will talk about today. So there are ways to address these sometimes conflicting desires, but they require an additional level of care and intentionality. And some of the ways that we can kind of support the process of learning to avoid misgendering is using gender neutral or inclusive language where it's appropriate. Also distinguishing different aspects of gender, kind of like the different aspects that Kirby was just discussing when gender is relevant and we do want to talk about it. There are also discursive strategies like hedging, for instance, and I'll show some examples. And of course, meta-communication about these linguistic practices is a really important component, not just doing pronoun introductions, asking people about their pronouns, but also talking to people about why we do this, how we can support people in their pronoun use, what to do when people get misgendered, etc. So I'll just present a couple of strategies from Zimmern 2017. This is a paper in the first issue of the Journal of Language and Discrimination, if you'd like to Google it before we get to the references. Basically this piece is kind of a primer for those who might be wondering where to start with trans-inclusive language. And some of the bigger principles that I discussed there, the notion of self-identification as driving reference practices, the need for meta-communication that I just mentioned, specifically pushing back against the normative gender assignment process. So using people's pronouns correctly isn't just a matter of doing kind of a find and replace for pronouns. It's really about understanding gender in a more complex way that goes beyond kind of the normative logic of gender assignment, in which perceived physiological characteristics tend to be the predominant feature that drive normative pronoun assignment. So the logic instead is that a person's gender and pronouns cannot be identified by looking at them. And from this perspective, asking for pronouns is a normal and indeed necessary thing to do, not at all an insult. Yet it's also clear that certain ways of asking for pronouns can be experienced problematically for trans people. And so asking really has to be done in particular ways that I think linguists are well positioned to engage with. So normalization of asking for pronouns is one of the things that came up a lot in our survey, and certainly shows up a lot in sort of the general activist discourse about pronoun exchanges. And importantly, these kinds of practices, these strategies, are not just special strategies for use when talking about trans people. They are ways of talking about gender, sex, the body, identity more generally. And I should say, if students pick up on the fact that you use special language when you're talking about trans people, and then normative language when you're talking about cisgender people, that is something that will be noticed by trans students and people in general. So we've heard a little bit about some of the strategies that can be used in cases where gendering someone is really not necessary. So gender neutrality, these are some of the kinds of pairs that Evan talked about: people over women and men, parent over mother and father, they over he or she, and even in strongly marked contexts. So for instance, talking about pregnant people rather than pregnant women. And this is an especially kind of key issue at the moment because of the rise in anti-trans rhetoric among people who describe themselves as gender critical, which is sort of the self-identified term of people who are TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, where there's a lot of focus on naturalizing biological sex and using that against trans people. There's also explicit inclusion beyond the binary, so all genders rather than both genders, any sex over either sex. I think, significant, and perhaps especially in a pedagogical context, is how we talk about gender in cases where it clearly is relevant. Here are some examples that I talk about in this article where people are using the word women, but referring to different things. So in the first example, women grow up being taught to accommodate others' needs. What we're talking about is gender assignment at birth and not necessarily identification as a woman. Similarly, women face negative assumptions about their professional capabilities. This is a matter of perceived gender or maybe gender role, depending on how you use that term, but it's about how people are perceived. And then all women need access to cervical cancer screenings. This is obviously about a specific body part. And note that none of these are actually about how a person understands themselves. This is not gender identity. And that's probably the context in which we want to use the word women or men or another identity-based gender term. So I mentioned earlier, hedging is one possibility, a strategy that actually goes a pretty long way. So saying things like women often grow up being taught to accommodate others' needs. Most women face negative assumptions about their professional capabilities. Women typically need access to cervical cancer screenings. So these are all improvements. And of course, they're also more accurate statements, right? Not all women, not all cisgender women even need access to cervical cancer screenings. But we can do a little bit better. And I think, again, thinking pedagogically, thinking about wanting our students to understand these concepts because of their importance in language, is that we can be more specific about what it is we're discussing. And this overlaps with what Kirby was just talking about as well. So we can say that people who are assigned female at birth, and we might want to keep the hedge, often grow up being taught to accommodate others' needs. Most people perceived as women face negative assumptions, and people with cervixes typically need access to cervical cancer screenings. So these all have the benefit of being factually more accurate, in addition to not implicitly misgendering entire groups of people by equating being a woman with being assigned female at birth, or the capacity to have, or having a cervix, or being perceived as female. So these are pretty straightforward strategies, and they're ones that I've been sort of presenting to people for some time. And I'll just point out that, again, none of these are actually about gender identity, but rather things that tend to correlate with it. And that's kind of where we want to be in terms of our specificity. So in a classroom context, specifically, of course, you want to avoid making assumptions about students' identities in general, certainly their genders. These are the, I should say, these are the recommendations that I have historically provided to people kind of looking for rules, essentially, what, like, step by step, tell me what to do. So asking students to share pronouns during introductions in class, if the class is small enough to have them, or if not, then avoid gendering students at all unless they've shared that information with you. Attending to trans affirmative language in discussions of gender and sex, so not just thinking about, am I being trans affirmative when I'm talking about trans people, but also when I'm talking about cisgender or people who are assumed to be cisgender. Treating pronouns like names is something that I've advocated for some time. Of course, individuals are the authority on their own names. You can't tell from looking at somebody what their name is. You have to ask. You can't know what someone's name is by knowing their gender identity, just like you can't know their pronouns from knowing their gender identity. You have to ask. And we also know that some names are easier for any given individual. Some names are a little bit harder, but that it's part of being a professional, as well as a kind and compassionate person, to do our best, even with a difficult name. Yes, and using these practices even when you think no trans people are around. Of course, there are also many specific pedagogical adjustments that might need to be made for trans-inclusive teaching. And it's really important to speak to experts in those areas who are also either trans themselves or extremely knowledgeable about trans communities by virtue of extended engagement at the community level. In representing research, we also have a few things to think about. So when an author writes about women and men, should we fill in the word cisgender and say this article is about cisgender women and cisgender men? And this is where we can have our academic critical thinking come in, and we can ask, do we actually know the trans status of the participants in this study? Generally, we don't. Do we know that the authors are actually assuming that the participants were cisgender? Did they just say women and men, or did they say something that made it clear that they were assuming their speakers were cisgender? So what do? I advocate for generally sticking with what is in the article. So if the article never says that the study is about cisgender women and cisgender men, it is making an assumption to say that that's who the people in the study were. It's very plausible that populations of linguistic studies include trans people who were never asked if they were trans, and so the researcher never got that information. Consider also talking about people who are assumed to be cis, since this is often how these studies are sort of framed as embedding that assumption, and talk to students about this issue. So why is it that we can't insert cisgender here? Why is it that we can't just use women and men without thinking about it further? But I do think that in general, it's good to use the language that authors use, but do so with a critical framing. So I just want to share a little bit from this survey that I mentioned. Here are some of my lovely collaborators from the Trans Research and Linguistics Lab at UCSB. And we've been working on this project over the course of a few years, designing a survey, conducting it, doing analysis. It's quite massive at this point. And part of what we wanted to do was recognize the differences that exist within trans communities regarding how language in the classroom is experienced. So rather than kind of having the entire story be my set of recommendations based on my research with trans people, what do we do with the fact that some trans people don't want to be asked for pronouns in the classroom? And is there a way of reconciling these perspectives? So a little bit about this survey. It was administered to 84 trans plus students and employees. So we define that as including people identified as trans and or non-binary and or non-cisgender. This included 65 students, most of them undergraduates, and we did the survey in winter of 2020. So unfortunately, it was interrupted by the start of the pandemic, and we stopped collecting data because everything had changed. So we asked questions about identity, coming out experiences, academic experiences, with a focus on linguistic components of that. We asked people about their experiences with support and mistreatment on and off campus, and their situations with respect to housing, employment, healthcare, and other kinds of sort of structural access to meeting their basic needs. So a little bit about who took the survey. The vast majority of survey takers were assigned female at birth, which seems to be a broader tendency among younger academics, that people were assigned female at birth. So that's trans men and non-binary people assigned female at birth seem to be really overrepresented, especially in the humanistic and social scientific fields. We also, oh, I don't know why I did it in that order. Okay. There were also really, for the most part, non-binary identified survey takers, so 78%. That was followed by trans men and trans women in smaller numbers. There was also an overrepresentation of white respondents compared to the overall population at UCSB, only 22% from underrepresented racial minority groups. And it's not clear whether that's representative of the trans population at UCSB or a matter of who responded to our survey. We're currently doing interviews to follow up on a lot of this. So one notable thing is that 82% of these folks use they, them pronouns, though only 38% go by they, them exclusively. Others went by they or he, they or she, or all three of them. And oops, extra bullet point there. And about 75% reported that they had been misgendered in class. But only 70% expressed an overall positive orientation to being asked for pronouns in class, and others had either conflicting or primarily negative views. So just some of the factors that mattered for students who responded included it drawing too much attention to the student or other trans people. And note that this is quite lopsided. So the number of people who said, I like being asked for my pronouns because it creates visibility for trans people was 31. So there is a really clear trend in terms of how people respond. But we do have people saying, I don't like sharing my pronouns with strangers. It feels awkward, or instructors don't do it well. And one really important point here was that a lot of people talked about how they were misgendered even if they were asked for their pronouns. And so it felt like there was very little payoff for them. Other students responding negatively was an answer people gave. Some people felt it was unnecessary and kind of felt like people who don't use the expected pronouns should just tell people. People occasionally wanted to know what people would guess if they had to guess a pronoun. One person wanted to share pronouns one-on-one. One felt that it invalidates their identity. And other people mentioned feeling targeted or wanting sharing pronouns to be a choice. But other people emphasize that it shouldn't be a choice, that everyone should be expected to share their pronouns, because otherwise often cisgender students or others who kind of can take for granted that they won't be misgendered forget or otherwise don't give their pronouns. So there were a lot of references to feeling singled out, being forced to out oneself. The class size and makeup was significant for people, and this fact that trans people often feel vulnerable about sharing their pronouns, while cisgender people may simply forget to do so. So some adjustments to our practices that attempt to take all of this into account. We get to keep our point, don't make assumptions about people's gender identity, their trans status, or their degree of outness based on the pronouns they share. But people also mentioned the benefits of asking in a way that's context specific. So how would you like others to refer to you in this space or this class? Noting that people might not use the same pronouns in every context, and students may know other students from other contexts and be concerned that they will start using the pronoun they share in class in these other spaces where they may not use that pronoun. Providing context about why you are asking about pronouns is also really important. And as part of that, setting expectations for the class. So being clear that, that members of the class are expected to use the pronouns that people share. A great way to do that might be to teach the LSA statement against linguistic misgendering in your class. And we are really lucky to be linguists and to have the opportunity to talk about these things at length as part of our course material. Students should also be encouraged but not required to share their pronouns, but crucially, if students don't share their pronouns, avoid gendering them and apply this equally to all students and let students know in advance. So if students would like to be referred to with gendered pronouns, they know that they need to provide those pronouns in order to be referred to as such. And this prioritizes not misgendering the people who are most likely to be misgendered. Finally, reaching out to students individually or inviting students to share their pronouns individually is a good way of reaching those who might not feel comfortable sharing them in the class, but who still want to make sure that if you refer to them in class, you'd use their correct pronouns, or just that you know their pronouns. And as part of this, it's really important to have communication with students about what they would like to have happen if they are misgendered in class. Do they want you to jump in and make a correction? Do they want to let it pass and not worry about it? Do they want you to maybe talk to the person after the fact? Those are all options, and people have different feelings about what's appropriate. So some quick conclusions, since I'm sorry I'm over time. These problems really require a level of creativity that is challenging even for those of us who think about these things every day. So it's so important that trans people be in positions of power that recognize their expertise, because this is something that lived experience provides so much insight into. Bringing trans students and colleagues and community members into these conversations is really important, and providing real reward and compensation to those who do so. Trans affirming language is also an ongoing project. So this isn't the thing, a kind of thing where you go to a webinar, you learn it, and then you're done. This really needs to be part of a bigger picture, bigger conversation about sociolinguistic justice. So I will stop there. I do have some slide references if people would like those. And I'm not sure, do I need to pass the baton on to somebody else, or?
Pass it to Lex, please.
Okay.
So as we wrap up, I just want to thank everyone for being here, but I especially want to thank all of the presenters who shared really great information. I'm so glad to be colleagues with all of you. And so as we wrap up, we just kind of want to remind you all that talking about misgendering and how we talk about gender and language is really important. And also it is just one part of creating trans affirming practices. Lex, this is like a weird, can you make it full screen somehow?
It is full screen.
Okay,
So
well,
I think I was just the wrong person to put in the driver's seat for this webinar.
Well, basically, as you think about these things and creating trans affirming practices in your, that's perfect, academic life, also think about reading and assigning and citing the work of trans linguists and hiring them, inviting us to, and other trans linguists to come to your classes, talk about their work and compensate them for their time. And think about the ways that you can advocate for your trans students and colleagues through these types of inclusive language practices, but also becoming familiar with resources on your campus for trans students, and ultimately materially investing in trans people and their safety and well-being. We have some final resources here, some academic work. Lal has a bibliography on his website about translinguistics. There's some great books, and both Lal and Kirby have blogs. There's some very different podcast episodes. And if you're interested in getting involved with COZIL at all, you can email me, and hopefully you can be involved in future projects we are doing. And I just want to leave you with some questions to think about before we open it up for Q&A. So given all of the things we've talked about, are there areas that you think you have the most room to improve? Or is this something that you want to work on primarily in your teaching practices, or maybe something that Kirby said about research that struck you? Is there something, maybe what is something from each of the different panelists that you want to implement in your work? And think about taking this to the departments that you're a part of, and what is something that you think you could share with them that we talked about here today. So with that, thank you all so much for being here. I see some people have been submitting questions as we've been going, but you can continue to submit questions in the question box, and I'll ask all my panelists to come back and put your videos on, and we'll have some time for questions. I think we had one early on that said, is the idea of using they with someone whose pronouns you don't know until you know otherwise, that although it's temporarily misgendering, at least it's not reinforcing the artificial gender binary? Kirby.
Thanks for letting me dibs that one. Descriptively, but this is anecdotal, I haven't collected data on this. When people say that this is what they do not do it to everyone. And so if you are saying that this is what you want to do, I encourage you to carry around a little notepad with you all day for a couple days and put a tally in it each time you hear yourself say a pronoun, because pronouns are a functional category, they're a closed class in English, people are less aware consciously of their own pronoun use. So this is one of the reasons that somebody can get a name change right but still be messing up pronouns for months or years, is because they're less aware that they are doing it. So if that's a strategy that you want to undertake, I encourage you to be extremely self-meta-linguistically aware. I'm sorry. Yeah, because people will say that this is what they do and then they don't do it. They do it only when they see somebody who's sufficiently gender weird by appearance. Yeah, that's what I want to say about that.
Did anyone else have any other thoughts on that one?
That was a good addendum, and I'd say that applies both to the, using they. If you're going to do it for everyone. It's the same with asking for pronouns. Like, if you're going to ask for pronouns, ask everyone for pronouns.
And I think just functionally, singular they has more than one meaning. It is both a generic pronoun that people use in reference to those whose gender is unknown or irrelevant or whatever, and a pronoun that specific people use every time they are referred to. And so that makes it a little bit tricky, but they are two different things, I think, and that's also why some people are great at using it in the generic context, but completely fail at using it for non-binary people and others who use they, them.
Yeah, if you want to hear more about that, I have much academic writing on the matter that you can have if you want.
Another question we had, which says, I have been asked why we use 2 or 3 or 4 pronoun case forms when we identify our pronouns. Are there reasons that to do this that we haven't, okay, this person says, it normalizes knowing what the forms of the pronoun are. It helps people think about, how pronouns show up in a sentence. Are there other reasons we might do this?
I think in cases of neopronouns, that's one situation where people might need all of the forms, or you might not be able to tell from the first form what the other ones would be. I personally, because I use 2 sets of pronouns, I usually just use the nominative forms because it gets really bulky otherwise. So to me, this is in large part a matter of convention, but I don't know if other panelists have other thoughts.
I think it's one of those things where, as a linguist, I want to say, well, we haven't studied this, but we can make some general observations. And as sort of people who have preferences about our own pronouns, I can say this is not one of those things that I personally have a preference about. And I've never met any other trans person who has a strong feeling about how many are the right number of forms to share, except, I don't know, this one sounds right, which tells me that there might be something sort of language internal and less social going on there.
I've actually heard people say that I've heard trans people say that if they want to be cis, they will use 3 sets, like he, him, it. And I think that's really fascinating. So that is a stereotype, I think.
There's the stereotype that cis people have 3 and trans people have 2 or fewer. Yeah, have others heard this? I love this because I think it's very funny to have stereotypes of cis people. Sorry.
That makes a lot of sense.
Just looking at the modal, we've been consistent. I don't think any of us cheated, but we all put our pronouns in our display name, and we all put 2.
Yeah.
Well, 2. Oh, right, 2 total. Yeah.
2 total.
Yeah. Well, I think there's been a change among trans people. I feel like trans people used to use all 3, and that it got shortened to 2. And so I think cis people are just sort of, they follow us in these forms of language change, so they're going to be a bit behind.
Mm-hmm.
This strikes me like I appreciate what you were saying, Kirby, about how we haven't studied it yet, because I can't help but wonder if this is like a free variation thing that's analogous to the difference between themself and themselves, because some people have very strong judgments about that, and others use both interchangeably. So anyways, I think we should study it.
Colleagues of mine and I have recent new results on the themselves thing. And I will go pull the OSF link and drop that in the chat for y'all real quick. But yes, something's going on, and it's linguistics.
Everything is linguistics.
Okay, we got another question that says, someone mentioned that implicit misgendering through the use of they, them, especially targets trans women. Advice for acknowledging this in life and research that doesn't reify the gender binary or assign gender at birth as proxy or perpetuate other forms of trans misogyny.
We do have a panel of 4 trans masks and a cis guy. Sorry about that. I think that one thing that we should say is that acknowledging trans misogyny isn't doing it necessarily. And that you can start with the premise that this is a force in the world that affects people without necessarily agreeing with the premise upon which it is based.
I think asking questions is a great strategy in general. Like, oh, I noticed that you use they pronoun, which also helps because, maybe you don't know this person's pronouns or something, and you're actually learning in the process that these are their pronouns. So just saying, why that pronoun? Is that how so-and-so refers to themselves? Asking questions, and then, if the answer is something like, oh, actually, I have no idea, then you've at least planted a seed of something to think about.
Mm-hmm. I think to sort of coming back to, I really liked, Lal, how you were talking about like drawing an analogy between pronouns and names. And just like we endeavor to remember what people's names are, try and remember what people's pronouns are. And so ask about them for sure, but actually do, I know this seems like really straightforward advice, but like do try and integrate that information into how you view this person, how you understand this person, because I think also an important part about the usage of pronouns that we don't talk about quite as often is the fact that when we use pronouns to refer to somebody, we are in effect categorizing them too. And sometimes that can be what's most difficult for people about changing the pronouns that they use to refer to someone in their life, is that it's not even just so much that their pronouns have changed, but their understanding of a person's category has changed as well. So that's something that I would encourage folks to be mindful of, and also to just like practice in private if you have to. That's totally fine. I have some really wonderful friends of mine who told me a story once about how they spent a whole day cleaning their apartment and just talked about me in the third person. And it was like an overnight change. And so I'm not saying that that's necessarily the solution, but I do think that committing those pronouns to memory are crucial. And I also want to echo what Kirby said about how acknowledging transmisogyny is not the same as perpetuating transmisogyny, but to just think about the ways in which maybe it might feel more comfortable for you to de-gender trans people in your life, and reflect on why that might be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that came out pretty clearly in a lot of the different presentations about how this is not just about, you know, finding and using the right language, but thinking about like what we are saying, why we're saying it, being specific about what we mean and about what that communicates about what we think about gender and how we categorize other people. And so I just wanted to, I really liked that everyone was making that point. We got 2 more questions. So can someone address the verb forms for singular they?
So this is a question that people ask me a lot, and it's difficult because this is one of the things where it's like, well, as a linguist, I can observe that mostly people use plural verb agreement when they use plural verb agreement with plural they. And if they have, but my observation is that mostly whatever verb agreement you use with plural they, you tend to also use that with singular they. And an analogy I really like is that people use the same verb agreement for plural and singular you. And then sometimes people are sort of push this question because you kind of want a right answer of like, well, which verb agreement should I use? And it's, oh no, you've gotten us into the point where I'm going to say, I'm a linguist and I don't want to tell you the answer. I want to know what you naturally do. So that's an unsatisfying answer sometimes, but I think that that's as good as you're going to manage to get out of any of us. Is that fair to say? I don't want to speak for everybody here, but as much as you're going to manage to get out of us is, I don't know, what do you do? What comes out of your mouth when you say it? And then do that.
To piggyback on that, Kirby, I always hear plural verb agreement with the generic singular they.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to, again, only come up when we're talking about specific non-binary they. So
because they're different.
Right.
It's the search and replace thing again, right? It's the desire to construct your sentence and then change the pronouns out, and then you're going to end up with weird agreement. If you just start with the pronoun, you will naturally produce whatever your variety has you produce for that pronoun.
Yeah.
And there was another question that says, thinking about the presence of multilingual and linguistically racially minoritized trans folks in the discipline, I've seen a trend of Latinx folks having pronoun sets like she, her, ella. How might curriculum of these trans inclusive language models be conscious of the different languages and experiences our community brings to the table? Which is a great question.
We should have some links. Does anybody have the links handy? There's some links. So there's some great existing resources on a few different sort of gender diversity in languages projects that are out there. And I'm going to go wrestle them up, and then I'm going to plug my crowdsourced bibliography in case anybody has anything to add. So I'm going to mute myself while I do that so somebody else can talk.
One thing I can add to that, just coming from the survey that I talked about, was that, you know, in language classes, students often ran into not only the same set of issues with being misgendered, but then additional issues when it was time to communicate outside of the classroom. So there might be a set of grammatical forms they're using in class, and those may be different from the pronouns they use in English, and people are not always given the opportunity to share that. And of course, students in language classes often communicate with each other, not in the language they are studying. Yeah.
Well, this is the end of our webinar. Did anyone have any kind of last thoughts they wanted to share with the audience?
I'd like to add that I think that last question about racialization is really important and should be a central question, because that so infrequently makes it into discussions of pronouns, both as an Anglocentric kind of area of consideration, and in terms of thinking about standard language ideology and what kind of impacts it has on students of color to be using forms that are recognized as non-standard by some, and kind of factoring that into the way that we engage with pronouns, especially in our classrooms.
Amazing. Thanks again for everyone for being here. Feel free to reach out. The PowerPoints are accessible on the LSA website, so you can get all of the kind of resources, references, and links that people plugged there as well. Have a good weekend.
Thanks so much.